Dr. Brooks had 2 years ago agreed to write an essay for the catalog, and this is my opportunity to say the exhibition catalog is available in the gift shop, and I bet you that he will be happy to sign it if you ask him to. And so over these 2 years, I've worked with him, and so I'm so thrilled that now that we were getting ready for the symposium, and he also agreed to basically frame the whole panel and frame the topic of the panel, which is reflected in this wonderful title, Race, Space, and Abstraction in the American South. Dr. Brooks teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at the Lehman College of the City University of New York. He has published interviews, poetry, essays in numerous publications, and is curator of the Racial Imaginary Institute and executive producer of Culture Context, which is a series of online conversations with artists. And I will say they are available on Vimeo, and they're wonderful interviews with artists, very insightful interviews with artists, mostly African and African-American artists. So Dr. Brooks is joined by 3 very accomplished artists. I'm thrilled that they took the time from their busy schedules to be here today to participate. Sheila Pre-Bright, who is second on the right, is an acclaimed fine art photographer who has received national attention for her series Young Americans, Plastic Bodies, and Suburbia. Her most recent body of work is the 1960 Now series, which focuses on the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement. Her upcoming book, 1960 Now, is published by Chronicle Books and will be released October 2nd. And if you'd like to order the book, I'm sure she'll tell you how to do that. Tokwase Dyson, who is next to Sheila Pre-Bright, is a painter who uses geometric abstraction to create a language that considers how individuals negotiate architecture and natural landscape. As an abstract painter, Ms. Dyson has exhibited nationally and internationally. Next month, she opens a solo exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York City and is participating in a group exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art titled Between the Waters. Tokwase attended Tougaloo College many years ago. Currently, she's on the board of the Architectural League of New York as Vice President of Visual Arts and visiting critic in painting at Yale School of Art. Dyson is based in Jersey City, New Jersey. Philandus Thames, who's next to me here on this side of the table, he was born in Mississippi, has a connection with this museum through a high school program for advanced performing arts students, and in 2005, he received the Mississippi Individual Artist Fellowship. He received his MFA from Yale University in painting and printmaking. Thames has exhibited his work in many exhibitions in New York, New Haven, Connecticut, Aspen, Colorado, Miami, Florida, and also here at the MMA. He recently was a nominee for the prestigious Louis Comfort Tiffany Prize. His work can be found in collections in the US and abroad. He's a visiting critic in the MFA printmaking program at the Rhode Island School of Design. Please help me welcome these panelists. Laurent.
Thank you, Johan. 2 years ago, I was at a poetry retreat, a Kavikana poetry retreat, and I'm in my head writing poems, and he calls me and says, I'm thinking about, could you possibly write this essay? And he's so kind, and I'm thinking about poetry. My head's in the clouds. But 2 years of conversations since that point. Edits, very kind edits to the catalog essay. I just want to say thank you for all your work, and thank you just for being a very solid person for this exhibition and for the catalog. And thank you, Johan. And thank you, Mississippi Museum of Art, for this conversation. So, salute. So I want to start from that particular point. I want to start from the point of writing the essay I did for the catalog. Johan, he provided a huge amount of photographs of images to look at. And I kind of narrowed the images down to the Freedom Riders, images of the Freedom Riders, and then a few other images, because I was thinking about civil rights. I was teaching the class on civil rights and fine art, and I was thinking about civil rights. And just in those Bruce Davison photographs, I began to learn Mississippi. My parents are from Alabama, and so I knew of the South kind of from New York. I'm a sort of satellite kid. And so I kind of knew about the South, and then just thinking about Mississippi, thinking about the civil rights struggle, thinking about my own kind of connections to it, the artwork brought me closer to my own understanding of myself, and so it became kind of personal for a minute. Then when I arrived in Jackson, the photographs of the bus depot and then the Freedom Riders, that stuff became real to me because it's so intimate. The streets are so intimate. They're smaller than the sort of outsized way you may think about how American history moves and democracy and these kinds of large concepts. We think of, they happen on huge battlefields or whatever, but I saw the streets of downtown Jackson and I was like, oh my God, it is so intimate what happened here. And I started thinking about space and spatial relationships and the ways in which our activities, the ways in which we navigate space, and the ways in which our even activism is sort of channeled by space. And so, everyone here on the panel sort of deals with space in sort of different ways because proximity, right? My proximity to my own history, to my parents' history, to the South and the civil rights movement is kind of distant, but physically, as we walk around the city, as we walk around these spaces, our proximity to these spaces, maybe we take them for granted, but they affect the way in which we think about life and how we move through life and how we think about what we do. So when I think about Takwasi, when I think about everyone's work here, I sort of have to think about, how is their work speaking, maybe not necessarily to the civil rights movement, but how they think about how space and how it works on us and how it sort of moves us and how we navigate it. So I started with this image here, Black Intimacy, and Takwasi, her work is really about space and how space develops. And for me, she may just, correct me, probably will. But for me, the ways in which, if you think about topography and looking over a space and thinking about architectural designs and how space is fluid, but then you build a wall, and then you have that line here, right? And so there are ways in which this is a city, looking down on a city, and you can sort of navigate that space. And I may have gotten that completely wrong. Yeah. But would you want to speak about your work in space?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, hello everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm so happy to return. I'm a Tougalooan, and it's been very many years since I've been here. And I want to give a shout out to Mr. O'Hara, who's sitting right there, and my best friend Hope Jones, who's sitting right here, and her beautiful daughter Taryn. So, it's really amazing to return as a Tougalooan, and I'll start from that particular point in space. Instead of work, not only because my best friend is here and my wonderful professor is here, but I work from there on to where I am now. And being at Tougaloo, I learned two particular things that shaped my life. And one is how to negotiate space through love and friendship, which Hope helped me do and form very immediately. So the way in which we lived together and ate together and spoke together was, again, a reflection of the intimacy of the architecture at Tougaloo. And then with Mr. O'Hara's class, our class was in this sort of the sculpture class, remember, in the original building. It was this narrow hallway which opened up into a larger room. And then so you go from dorm to the art department, and then you sort of meander around the campus, and you see different kinds of architectural formations that have been sort of inserted into this, what used to be a slave plantation in different times, right? And each building definitely talks about that history very uniquely in its shapes and forms. So as an abstract painter, what leads my studio practice is trying to figure out the shapes and forms that really define us, redefine us, and not only define us politically and spatially, but define us intimately and define how we feel about our own capabilities. So that idea of shape, form, space, spatiality, intimacy, capabilities, and politics, working from that set of knowledge and thinking about the history of abstraction, I understand the history of geometric abstraction and understanding and telling those stories, a sort of incomplete project within abstraction. So if I am to look at that genealogy and relationship, and I'll just throw one name out there, someone like Ellsworth Kelly, I understand how the shape logic was a shape logic that was in a sort of autonomy with where the object ends and where the object begins, but also within the history of that kind of abstraction. So I'm sort of put in a situation where, I'm learning about art on what used to be an enslaved people's plantation, and I'm thrusted into an art world where they think about these kinds of abstractions that also have to deal with shape. So right now I'm with this piece called Black Interiority. It's an example of how I use those histories and to create an amalgamation, to use an amalgamation to make paintings that bring that conversation forward. So Black Interiority, the painting that you're looking at, which was acrylic on canvas, it's two 60 by 60 panels. They're 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide, each panels. So it's a fairly large piece. But what you're looking at is a sort of shape language that I referred to, that I'm thinking through, and I'm sorry, I'm dealing with language right now, but I'm thinking about calling it the hypershapes. And hypershapes in relationship to abstraction and space says, how do we, as people of color, how are we formed by shapes in space and architecture? So what you're looking at is a elevation view of different shapes that I have put together that have a sort of history for liberation and people who are self-emancipate. So to make a long story short, what you're looking at is a rectangle, a triangle, and a curve. The rectangle, I think about Harriet Jacobs, the 90-degree angle, I think about Box Brown, and the curve, I think about Anthony Burns. And these are all individuals who were enslaved but self-liberated through some kind of architectural space. So that's where I am. I use these sort of architectural spaces and shapes to formulate compositions and paintings that speak viscerally to those histories, but also contribute to the conversation around abstraction. So that's it.
Thank you. Let's be all the works. We're just going to let each one speak. Yeah, and then we're going to move forward.
Sorry, that was such a thought out loud, I think. I usually write things down.
And so when I saw this work of Charles Pearson, who was a freedom writer, and the way it was captured in space, the ways in which this actually spoke to sort of the landscape, the ways in which it spoke to space, because it's not really a direct portrait, it's an artist capturing something in space. It's a huge blow-up photograph, and it kind of speaks from the background. But could you speak about your practice?
Actually, I want to thank everybody for allowing us at the Mississippi Art Museum to really talk about Black space and Black bodies. And when I think about Black space, I think about mental war, and I think about how Black bodies are in a constant struggle for liberation globally. And 2013, Trayvon Martin happened. And I, as a visual cultural producer, I use photography as a way to understand the brainwashing that continues to create this division amongst all of us. And I started thinking about young people during the civil rights movement who changed the face of the nation. And it's going to take young people in order to make the change. So I reached back to the unknown civil rights members of the civil rights movement and wanted to know who they were. And this is actually a photograph of Mr. Charles Pearson. He was one of the youngest freedom riders at the age of 19, where they took the bus to, I think, Anniston, Alabama, and where they burned the bus down. And he was so excited to see me because he says, "Baby, I thought that you were going to be some older person want to talk to us about the civil rights movement." So I was thinking more about intergenerational because of Trayvon Martin and how we have these new visionaries now that are activists that are on the ground that are fighting the same fights their grandparents and grandparents, the parents and grandparents that are fighting. And I call it a love movement because of the struggle. And so you see an image of a trail where Mr. Pearson was also a member of the Atlanta student movement, where the black colleges, where Mr. Lonnie King, who started the Atlanta student movement, and they actually took this path of where they used to march to, and this is the path downtown in Atlanta. And I wheat paste these images on the wall. And what was really interesting, because you had all these elders that were on the wall, and everybody wanted to know who they were. Well, they never told us about them in our history books. I mean, I had the homeless people out there, and they actually started giving people tours, to believe it or not, and talk to them about the images. And so that was in that space, because I don't think as black bodies we don't really have safe spaces at all for us, okay? Like I said, it's more of a mental war that's going on. And so I started this body of work, which led into 1960 Now, where I photograph the young people on the ground.
Thank you. Philandus, when you speak about your work?
Oh, sure, man. Did I make this? Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. So my studio, well, thank you guys for having me here. Like they said earlier, I grew up here, and a large part of my studio practice is investigating these spaces that black bodies occupy. My practice is about issues of trauma, invisibility, surveillance, and erasure, and issues around placelessness. And did you want me to talk about the broader project, or just specifically the previous image?
Previous images.
Okay. All right. So this particular image is about invisibility. This image itself was an image that I created by mining the Black Archive. I was thinking more specifically about like materials that are consumed by African Americans and people from the diaspora, and thinking about materials as having a specific kind of history. So basically, this image itself is an image of an image from the 1970s, a young black woman that's created out of hair barrettes, and it's meant to be seen in black light, and she's invisible. And I was thinking, like, as I was making the body of work, largely about like how the black female body has been largely left out of this larger narrative of a black popular culture. I guess that's the crux of my studio practice overall. One of the things I've been thinking about since I left graduate school is kind of the typecast or the floating signifier, which is in like the next image over. Like the image with the lips, if you can bring that up. I started at some point at the end of my time in graduate school, I was thinking about Black performativity and identity performance, and I encountered Sarah Bartman as a way of, and started using her as a way of talking about Black invisibility.
Could you explain who she was, Sarah Barton?
Sarah Bartman was the Hottentot Venus, and she became kind of this feminist structure by which to talk about trauma, of seeing the Black figure in the West. And I started using like the caricature or the lips as a way of talking about that particular space. And through that, I started using the lips as kind of a signifier of the Black body and Black trauma. And also, I began, I guess this piece right here, did you want me to hold off and talk about this one a little later?
Oh, we can, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, but hearing each one of you talk, I'm really thinking about the context of the exhibition. There is so much space in the exhibition in terms of all those years, hundreds of years of art making. And, you know, a lot of the work is representational, meaning that there's a figure and that figure represents a certain kind of history. And, you know, I guess it's a way for people from Mississippi to sort of recognize their own cultural heritage and how diverse and how complicated Mississippi has been for hundreds of years, right? And just thinking about, you know, space and race and how what we're seeing today in terms of, you know, these three artists fits into that greater narrative in terms of Mississippi, the idea of the sort of diaspora of Mississippi spread through concepts and representation. And so, you know, to Kwasi and Philan, this, you know, abstraction as a way to sort of reach some kind of terms of identity. And then, you know, photography for Sheila, photography is a sort of direct representational way to reach some kind of understanding of race and the history of race in the state. And these are completely different routes, right? But I'm just bringing, like, how do you think, to Kwasi and then Sheila, how do you think the way in which you work reaches your intended goal, you know, be it to say protest and the Black body needs, you know, and revealing our humanity. How do you think abstraction reaches that goal? And then Sheila, how do you think photography reaches that goal?
Well, I think a couple things, and I'll be shorter this time, but to say that abstraction is the reason that we're on the road of goals and fixing things in the first place. So if we look at abstraction as a sort of rubric and not a destination that somehow visual arts consumes, which if you do so, look at abstraction as something that only the visual art sort of consumes, I think you'd be short-sighted into understanding how, you know, image is used to twist and turn and contort. Land is used to twist and turn and contort. And colonization was used to twist and contort and hoard. So the reason why I'm interested in abstraction as a painter is to rethink specific moments in the exhibition that I'm interested in is around like how images and how painters were thinking about the Mississippi flood, how painters were thinking about the Mississippi water and landscape, and how painters were situating architecture within the southern landscape. And I think that dealing as an abstract painter, I spend most of my time in the studio really thinking about the history of those naturalistic paintings and beginning to break them down structurally, right? So a lot of those paintings are painted from a elevation view, right? There's a horizon line, there's the house and or the mansion and or the boat and or the water. So all of these things are really from a specific kind of vantage point, and I don't want to get into the history of perspective, but in this particular exhibition, what's telling in that landscape is how water and architecture and humans are very inextricably tied to each other, indelibly tied to each other. So the way in which, for me, to get back at that history is another way to understand not only the images of that history, but the interior architecture and spatial reality in those histories. So if I were to look at one of those paintings and see, can you go back to that first image? Just the black interiority one. So if I was to look into those images and see people on large and small boats trying to survive the Mississippi flood, then I can understand the importance of the curve. And then I can look into those boats and see how architecture is built on top of the curve, and I can see how stored and down the Mississippi River, where you have different conversations around routes, trade. I can begin through abstraction, really deconstructing those moments. So for me, as a painter, my studio practice is about trying to find those shapes in history that are indelibly tied to that kind of infrastructure and spatial history that is really also tied to the history of painting in a particular way. So for me, the exhibition and walking and looking at paintings, thinking about surface quality, thinking about gesture, thinking about drawing in painting, which I think is kind of incredible with the selections of work, is sort of paramount for my studio practice. So did that answer your question?
Yeah.
That's the way it's all connected. So abstraction for me is not, it's a rubric in which I understand the history of these kinds of abstraction, which are political.
Oh, yeah, it's the dimensionality, right? So if a horizon line goes like that, and then a sun goes like that, right? You flip it this way, another way, and then you have reworking the basic principles of how compositions are formed if you start from that realism.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I don't think about. There's a separation where there's a kind of way we think about representation in painting, right? There's a sort of naturalistic representation that I'm sort of away from. And to think about what it means to exist in a planal system or a scalar system, like this building we live in, we're surrounded by 90-degree angles. So if you look at this painting, there are enough 90-degree angles so you can be familiar with that space, right? A kind of drawing score line. But if you think about the Mississippi River, and you think about objects on the Mississippi River, that 90-degree angle, all the 90-degree angles that you see are most likely above the water line. So the curves that you see in the Mississippi, or in bodies of water, most likely exist under the water line. So how do I teach myself this way of knowing through abstraction, or this kind of history, without leaning on something someone else is already doing pretty perfectly? And for me, that's the way abstraction works. It's to get at those histories more intimately. That it's not about representation, it's about my own individual desire in the studio to get at that ancestorship that I cannot see.
Thank you. Sheila.
Yeah, with me, there's a body of work that I did, if you can put it up, Suburbia. Photography, the image is very powerful, and that's what persuades all of us. With Sarah Lewis' talk last night, she talked about Frederick Douglass and how he used his image for persuasion, because the image is very, very powerful. In 2006, I did this body of work called Suburbia, and I got tired of black space being used in urban America, because those are the images that are projected in the media that persuade all of us about what's going on with, unquote, all black folks. But I wanted to show the invisibility of black space and black bodies that lived in suburbia. And I won a major award for this body of work. And I was totally, as an artist, and when you're doing your work, you know, we live in the 21st century, and when I went to speak to curators, editors, consultants, basically they told me that I didn't have enough signifiers in this work to show that these were black people.
What would those signifiers be?
That's what I asked. A publisher said, I grew up around Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement, and you don't have enough signifiers. And I said, I had to make a joke. I said fried chicken watermelon, and what's another one?
I don't know.
Yeah, and he just couldn't
Bonnie.
say, yeah, he couldn't say anything. So imagery and photography is ingrained in one's unconsciousness. And when someone see this type of image and say to me that I didn't have enough, even though there's a black body, but you don't see their face, I did that purposely, and you see what the Newsweek and the future of technology, I was said, they read, I don't see any TV. So the persuasion of photography is very, very powerful. It could be used as propaganda, okay? And it's been used a lot in media because a lot of our narratives, African American culture narratives, has been controlled by the white male narrative. And that's how I use photography, because I want to control our narratives. I want to control our content. And a lot of that is being done right now by a lot of us. So the photography is very, very powerful for either negative or positive.
Thank you. It is interesting. I'll get to Philandus. I'm leading to a question for you, Philandus.
Okay.
Now. So, I mean, both of you are talking in a certain way about black interiority, to say black humanity, and to represent that in very, it would seem complicated ways, but ways that are familiar to people who are used to or on the inside of that particular culture, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you say there are no signifiers, the signifiers connect to popular culture, right? So mm-hmm. the things that lead to stereotype, right? The chicken, the watermelon, all that leads to stereotype. And you're talking about Business Week. Right? And I grew up reading like Black Enterprise and Ebony as a kid, and so like I mean to put that in a photograph would not seem black to people who want the easy representation, right?
Absolutely.
So there's a conceptual complexity to even the photography, not you know what I mean?
Yeah, I was told that this looked like my home. I don't see the difference in it. And I try to show the universal commonality amongst all people. I mean, my background, I'm a daughter of a soldier, so I was around diversity. I grew up in Germany in my younger years. And so it's when, you know, as an artist, you do work, and then when you put it out in the public, it really baffled me, because this is in the 21st century for someone to tell me that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Now, Philandus, you have a different route toward this intimacy. I mean, at least from what I see in this material culture at times, right? And so when you use things like brushes and these objects that are a part of, you know, the black interior everyday life, how do you see your use of these everyday objects as effective?
Well, like largely, I guess I'm concerned with like more or less interventions into particular practices of art history. Mm-hmm. And so I see myself as a trickster using these objects to impose a black body inside of these spaces. I guess that's perhaps the shortest route I could explain what it is I'm trying to do. Like I personally, with this particular work, I personally have family members that have been in the interior with this particular body of work, I have family members that have been incarcerated. And I was thinking about, like, more or less, what kinds of objects would they consume inside of the prison industrial complex? And how I can articulate those bodies without actually using a physical body to, like, physical black body. And so commonly in like the commissary or what have you, or in the notes of which you pass between families and family members, one of the recurrent themes or things rather that people consider as things they want are hairbrushes, and that's how I particularly arrived at using this material as a source material for making this body of work.
Wow, thank you. I mean, that's interesting because the body is implicit, right? The hairbrush has no function without a body to manipulate that hairbrush on hair. Is that Dr. Seuss?
But then you can relate it to the hand and labor and that sort of thing based on scale. And That's
Right,
what-
so the brush leading to labor in prisons as a
Right.
place where labor is exploited.
Exactly. Free labor.
Free, basically free labor. And what's interesting, I really like how the body is implicit in all of your work. You know, Takwasi, the body through these spaces or navigated by these spaces, right? Sheila, the body as an object to bring across your meaning or what you want to say as a photographer. And Philandis, you know, things like brushes, right? How did you come toward, because did all of you start with realism in like when you first started your art career or you started being an artist, all of you start with realism in the beginning? Anyone can jump in.
I don't think you can actually, if you study art, I don't think you can start at any other point. If I'm saying formally, like they start off, all drawing classes, 101, whatever. It's, you know, you move from objects to figuration and then interior spaces and things like that after, but I don't think you could, you know, can start from any other point.
Like the fundamentals.
Right, it's the fundamentals. You
Right.
know?
And so, Takwasi, you using those fundamentals, but you're like really flipping those fundamentals, 90-degree angles. I mean, this is accelerated kind of, you know. At what point, like, where was there a leap that happened, or was it like a process of moving toward seeing the figure or the shapes figures makes and the degrees figures make, right? 90 degrees to what have you, to sort of breaking that up? I mean, was there a leap, or was it like a natural progression?
Sure. It really was a condition where I was hunting for meaning through different forms. We can look at that piece. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. So I'm going to just go back to the show and think about. I'm going to use an example. So the John Curry painting, Hoover and the Flood. So if I look at that painting, that John Curry painting, and I'm happy to see it in person in the exhibition down the hallway around the corner, I look at it and it tells me that there was an environmental disaster, that there was technology related to that environmental disaster in the background, and there were people affected by that environmental disaster in the foreground. So assuming even before I saw that painting, that I had some awareness of what it meant to be in the condition of global warming, what it meant to be in the condition or proximity to the condition of vulnerability in terms of housing and land and agriculture, just because that's the history of this country. And a condition between, again, living and working and learning at a place called Tougaloo College, there's the aftermath, or what Christina Sharp calls the wake of slavery. So in all of that, I landed at this geometric abstraction after taking courses at Tougaloo and, you know, sculpture and watercolor and drawing. If you know something, it's funny. When I was at Tougaloo and we had an art colony, and Benny Andrews came, and he was looking at one of my paintings, and it was all large and all over the place. Where I started, kind of large and all over the place. I wasn't really doing anything exactly representation. I've always just been all over the place. So even in my classes, I couldn't wrangle the idea of representation in a particular way. It just didn't interest me, but my professors did. But the idea of working from figure did not. So anywho, so I get to a space where I understand what it means to be under an environmental condition where architecture, infrastructure, environment, people, human-induced climate change, the Anthropocene, are now like blazing in my mind. And because I can paint does not mean I'm making good paintings. So Benny Andrews comes and says, oh, you can paint, and it's like, so what? Like, this man is talking about proximity in Mississippi. Benny Andrews comes to you, sits next to you, and you're like, I'm about to have a crit with Benny Andrews. And I think my shit is popping, and it is not. So he's sitting there, and I'm looking at my painting, and I haven't got that color shit down, and he's like, sucker. You know, he just basically calls me a sucker, and I'm like, oh, man, and I've just been called a sucker by Benny Andrews. Once I was called a sucker. Kerry James Marshall called me a sucker once. I kind of got called a sucker last night.
Seems like a good thing. I don't know.
Yeah, so I've been, this idea of proximity to really smart people having a background at Tougaloo and really believing that abstract painting and painting can answer some questions, it's just, that's where it happened. It wasn't overnight, it wasn't slow or fast, it's just bouncing around really amazing people, from, you know, my best friends to my faculty to everybody. It was just, I'm an amalgamation, I think, of a form of environmental justice, and I'm trying to apply it to abstraction, to, in my studio alone, hours and hours, trying to get a language that speaks to the intimacies of these environments that no one but myself can teach me.
Mm-hmm. Hearing you say like Benny Andrews, like getting to this point where you are, where your concerns are tied to your aesthetic, and the ways in which you had these, sort of older generation artists come and look at your work and not tell you what you need to be doing, right? But they said something about your work that allowed you to progress in terms of your technique, and then your technique began to meet your interests, and that was something. And so I just finished writing something about Joe Overstreet in back, right?
He has amazing painting back there also.
Yeah.
It's amazing painting.
And the ways in which he was mentored by Sergeant Johnson, Harlem Renaissance sculptor, the ways in which he was mentored by Hell Woodruff, the painter, and the ways in which they influenced his work to steer him toward somewhere where his aesthetic or his ability to make work met his interest. They didn't tell him what to do, right? And I'm wondering, give this to you, Sheila, and then Philandus, you can address this too. When Carrie James Marshall calls you a sucker, I'd wear that as a medal now, considering, whatever. But are there people or artists who influenced you just in terms of your mission, in terms of how your aesthetic or?
I think my background is a little bit different. I actually started off as a self-taught photographer. And so I didn't have that background in the art school until I went and got my MFA. And I can use the image that's in the show right now of Elvis Presley. He has a gun. And back in the mid-90s, I was around the rap culture, gangster rap. And I was around gun culture. And I had an image, and I wish I had it, I don't have it up here, where I had one of the guys point the gun at me, and I blurred him out. And if you put that image next to Elvis, it's gonna read so totally different. So as I'm moving forward, it's going to get my MFA, I'm thinking, oh, this is a hot, image or whatever, and they're looking at me because it's a black male behind that gun. And what do you think when you see a black male behind that gun? Criminal, thug, drugs. And so for me, when I got into grad school with my MFA, I thought everybody was crazy, number one. But I actually learned a lot of how to bring up with the dolls conceptual, and my influence was actually through the Dada movement with Hannah Hawk, where she was dealing with women in the Industrial Revolution. And show the other image. This is, the cultural icon of the Barbie doll. So I actually started manipulating the Barbie doll because women of color, with the cultural icon, the idea of beauty, I was dealing with the concept of beauty and the idea with like Hottentot Venus. And in Western culture, the Barbie doll was what every woman from all nationalities needed to fit. And so I actually go to the next image, is it on there? I morphed the Barbie doll with young girls and talk about how we cannot fit that standard of beauty when it comes to Western culture. So my influence has come from the Dada, Hannah Hawk, and actually Richard Avedon and Andy Warhol.
That's a wonderful lineage.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful lineage.
Yeah.
Philandus, your influences?
So I was really blessed to actually have someone like Takwase as kind of an elder. And initially, when I was at the Tougaloo Art Colony, she was going into Yale, and she gave me some really great advice, going forward. But when I first left graduate school, two things happened. And I have to say, I also had a really great contemporary when I was at Jackson State, Lester Merriweather, who's on the front row. But when I first left Jackson State, when I first left Yale, I had a studio visit also with Kerry James Marshall after he had done a talk. And he came by my studio, and he was looking at everything in my studio. And he said to me, "Why are you making these things?" and explained that to me. And it drove me back to a conversation I had had with a contemporary of Sam Gilliam, where Sam was talking to this group of kids in his studio, and he had these 40-foot paintings in his studio and these 30-foot paintings. And he had these 3 paintings that were 3 feet by 4 feet lined up on the opposite side of the studio, things he was studying, things he was considering. And the kid in the studio was like, hey man, why are you making this work? This is how graduate students are. Like, I don't understand why you're making this work. And he said, I need to make a living. And so when I was having a conversation with Kerry, he was like, I really like the larger scale work that you were working on, but I don't understand these smaller works. And then he understood where I was coming from. But as I moved forward, like in that same week, I started walking through galleries in the city. And the very first gallery opening I went to was I walked in and David Hammons was standing right there eating olives. And he asked me, "What do you make, right? Are you an artist, or what do you do?" And I said, "I'm an artist." And he's like, "Okay, just follow me for the rest of the night. Don't say anything, just listen to me, talk to people." And all kinds of questions people were asking him, from why he felt that certain people were largely left out of the art historical discussion, to what he ate that morning and what he felt about, Rahsaan Roland Kurd or what have you. But we left and went to a collector's home. And the guy, could you go back to that previous image with the lips? The collector, A.C. Hudgens, if you don't know his collection, he has an amazing collection. He has about 20 very significant David Hammons pieces. And Nary Ward and a few other people. And A.C. had a piece of mine. And I sat there and I listened to David Hammons for a while, whole court. And one of the things that happened in the middle of that, he started asking everybody what they were working on, what they were making. And I have to say this too. He told us that we weren't in competition with each other. And that was pivotal for me to hear as a young artist, that you're making things as a young black artist to assert into the larger canon and to be supportive of each other. But he told AC to go in his closet and pull out the work he had just bought from me. And I started giving this really highbrow, falutin explanation of what I was doing, why I was doing, and how I arrived there. And he was like, "Well, talk to me plain now, right? You're from Mississippi, talk to me plain." And then that stuck with me. And then after I broke down what I was doing, formally and what have you, he took a piece of cardboard off of the box that the work was packaged in, and he dropped it on the floor. And he said to me, "That's art. Get there. When you can make that and say that that's art, you're making art." And I've kept that with me for the rest of my studio practice, and which kind of led me to materiality instead of being concerned with surface so much and all those other formal issues in making work.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that we are going to ask you guys if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Do we have a microphone, or does it matter? Okay, there's a microphone coming right now.
Hi. First, I'd like to say thank all of you for being here and for speaking. I'm an artist myself, and to Kwasi, I relate more to you because I too focus on abstraction, but not necessarily with shapes, but with color. And I wonder, like for you, did you ever, I know shape is a part of your work, like that's your main focus, but color is an integral part I see as well. And what do you think about that?
Well, I think a couple of things with color. So I have, do you want to pull up one of the paintings? So I think MacArthur talked about this earlier in talking about MacArthur Bennett, who's in the audience now, and I'll say with color or shape or surface or materiality, the best way to get at that form is to rigorously in your studio practice experiment with that thing. And so on a real practical level, because I am a teacher, I would say whatever palette you think you have now, triple it. Whatever is on the palette besides the paint, take it off. Whatever time you think you spend on the surface, spend twice the amount of that time on the palette. So because we're in, you're lucky in the sense that we're beyond sort of primary and tertiary, secondary colors now, only because technology says that you can make different kinds of pigments. So I would really get close to Albers, of course, and then I would get closer to Alma Thomas, of course, and then I would think about the plastic arts in relationship to, you know, I studied at Toulouse with acrylic, and then I went to oil, and, you know, understand the difference, you know, really physically in terms of the material. And then I would look at someone like Anoka Farouk. So follow the colorist, you know, quite frankly. Look at as many paintings as you can in person up close. And when I mean that if you think you've seen an Al Held black and white, or if you think you've seen even MacArthur's piece in the back, look close, look long. So I don't really have anything other, my paintings, oh, this is actually a black and white painting, but none of my other paintings are black and white. I shade down. So I mix all my colors in the studio, and it took me a long time to calibrate. Yeah, so this is red, black, and green. So when people approach me and say, oh, you know, you have this sort of black painting series, and I said, oh, are they? You know, are they really? Really? You know, shout out to Andres. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. And when you're trying to listen to music and mix color, turn the music off. You know, what else can I say about color, detail? You know, color aid and paper, get it out, mix it up. I don't know what else I can say about color. It's a thing that you'll have to wrangle down. I'm not sure if you're operating. Also, okay, so abstraction, one thing that I try to tell people about color and abstraction in rectangles is that understand that you can develop a perspective within abstract painting and color, right? And so shape languages allow you to get at distance. So, you know, I think that if you're dealing with color, you should absolutely deal with shapes, not to say that shapes should guide your compositions in the rectangle, but dealing with color compositionally, I think, would help you, you know, deal with color. And edge, right? So when one edge hits another edge, when that sort of luminosity hits between another. But I would say just stay in the studio and take it really seriously, if that helps in any way. Because color can work, you know, I mean, people work with color very different ways, so I would just say get a handle on it as a technical kind of thing.
Can I say something about that also? Is that cool? One of the things you should also do is consider mixing your own, like turquoise, mixing your own, like starting from pigments and mixing your own paint instead of buying stuff directly from the store. And I took a color class with Peter Hawley, and we looked at the history of painting, chose colorists to mimic that fit in within the context of our studio practices, and then begin to break down their practices and make paintings based off of those color schemes that were in the work. But then once you made that work, you'd made like 20 studies or what have you, and then use that as the kind of starting place for where you move forward.
Let me just say that, because we're both Yaleys, and I would say, look at your sidewalk, look at your
Yeah.
steps, look at your mama, and that's where you start.
There you go. Even better.
I have a quick question, and I thought it was really wonderful how all of you shared these moments of, you know, your practice and your theory and your struggling kind of through, you know, these moments of finding your voice and all that. And I wonder, I mean, I'm sure there's some, you know, sort of maybe younger people in this audience who are also kind of negotiating right now this issue. And I'm also looking back maybe at Sarah Lewis's presentation about, I mean, the word now is very important right now. Right now is the moment to create something that's important, that's activist, and that, you know, changes something, right? At the same time, I also see in all of your work this maturation, right? You know, there's this process where, you know, you get the critique, and you get you know, maybe a pushback or something that sparks you, and sort of maybe what's your advice? You know, how do you know, young students who, you know, are maybe, how do they negotiate this needing to make art that's now, and at the same time also having to maybe struggle?
It's really tough out here, you know, and I think you have to be true to yourself. A lot of young people come to me and want to know what is the formula of how to make it. And I always tell them, and I use this word, you have to have product. I'm just using product, but it's art, okay? And it's not about copying somebody else, not music, I'm thinking about music, of artwork to try to, which is similar to somebody else, so they can get in, because that's not gonna last at all. Do you want to be a one-time artist or a long-time artist? And you have to have a tough skin. You're going to get more rejections than yes.
Yeah.
I would say be diabolical, right? And I would say that what I mean by that is that absolutely it's tough. It's always going to be tough in particular. And, you know, you're going to be measured up against other artists, whether they come before you or after you, or whether somebody imagines them in the future. But my advice is to know that history, right? To know deeply, deeply this vast history of art that you're operating in. And to know deeply that history is to be able to have a conversation at any point, at any entry point, no matter the medium, the form, at any location on the planet. I don't care if you're, you know, I don't care if you're in Lisbon, I don't care if you're in Madrid, I don't care if you're in South Africa. Try to figure out the genre in which you come from. And relationships and conversations will sharpen what you think you understand about artwork. And then when you're, you know, you have a grasp on the field of that kind of knowledge, and you go into your studio, you just have to last your own failures, right? And you have to keep trying after you know you've made something that's inadequate up against somebody else, right? So it's a hard kind of condition to invent a new form, surface, content, right? And it's not for the weak at heart. You know, it's not playtime. And if you want to be in playtime, then you won't be with us, you know? So, and it's like I tell my students, it's a whole pool of mediocrity. So you have to decide if what you're going to exist in. And I think that comes from deep studio practice. And so in terms of strategies, apply to as many things as you can apply to so people can come see your work and give you a hard truth. And again, look at as much art as you can and be able to write about what you are making as best as you can, okay? And that's another thing. And I
Can I
think
add
that's for me, those are major things.
I'm going to add my own Kerry James Marshall thing in here. In one of his interviews, he says that, because Kerry James Marshall makes a wide body of work. I mean, different genres, and they're all excellent. He said, my personal, you know. So he said that he's excited about what he needs to learn to make the work.
Absolutely.
And it's not the
Absolutely.
finished work. He said every time he makes a new body of work, he said he gets excited about everything that he has to learn to make it, and that's what
Right.
keeps him making artwork.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when you get into your studio practice, when you get into your whatever, a writer, painter, follow your interests and then apply that at every particular level, at every particular, if it's a reading, and it can be completely unpopular.
Yep.
Completely unpopular,
Or
like,
underdeveloped.
right, yeah. And, you know, it's something that's a lonely process. If you don't like to be alone, then you may have a problem,
Yeah.
right? But if you're true to yourself and you're a curious person, painting, writing, it's a life of learning. A life of learning.
And I want to piggyback on that and say he's showing paintings up here, but I make sculptures, I make video, I made like 2 years. I made the worst animations ever. Like these things are so horrible. You remember? I mean, it's just woof. I mean, just awful stuff. But the idea is to understand and situate yourself to be prolific. Just decide I am a prolific artist. These are the things I'm going to do, and set yourself up to do that, which is hard, but if you decide that you're a prolific, like Kerry is, he's a prolific genius
Right.
who's setting himself up to make all these forms and exhaust the possibility of each form.
I was going to add that I read a quote once by Thelonious Monk, and he said, a genius is a person that's most himself, right? And I think of artists as kind of akin to geniuses in the way that a true artist, when you see one, there's nothing like that. And you know his work from anyone else's work in the context of history and the canon. But I would say figure out your own studio practice, what you're really, truly invested in making. And then from there, I would go see as much work as possible, especially if you're from here in Mississippi. I would, 3 hours away is Memphis, 3 hours away is New Orleans, so on and so forth. When I was here and trying to be an artist, I was making relationships with people at Tougaloo, Belhaven, Millsaps, and then I expanded the circle and expanded the circle. But, most people here are pretty privileged and have cars or friends with cars, and I would just make a weekend, go see some stuff. And then, like she said, it's a studio practice is really lonely. I spend 10 hours a day making stuff that may never see the light of day. And if you're not into that sort of thing, I suggest you don't make art. And also,
You can.
you should read more, as much as possible.
I have a question. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I
Next
can't see who's
week-
talking.
Nick, you can't hear me?
I can't
Next
see.
week, we will work with PTSD young people, and starting with, well, these are 14 to 17 years of age. But what would you look for in a child like 2 years of age or less, up to 10 years of age, with all of the marks all over your nice furniture and on your nice clean walls? What kind of lines could you look at and say that, wow, this child has talent? And that's the first question. And how do you integrate your wonderful gifts into the plain, ordinary child that you see on the street? How do you interact? How do you allow yourself
Okay.
a
Bring him to
teachable
this
moment?
exhibition.
Ma'am,
Bring the child here.
bring the child.
Bring the child here.
Yeah, bring the child here, and just try to make sure they don't touch any of the surfaces. But where do they, you know, I'm horrible like that. Please don't touch the art. But where do they look around? If they're looking at the floor, if they're, just let them take them to places where the activity is looking.
Yeah, and let them know it's okay. Like, I ruined all my parents, the encyclopedias with I'm old. Encyclopedia, anyone? Yeah. I ruined all the encyclopedias with crayons and the walls, and my mother was like, it's okay. For a kid, it's the activity.
Yes, yeah.
It's the activity. If they are unrepentant about just the activity, the craft will come. All that stuff will come. But if you see a kid who's just unrepentant about the activity, there's a certain level of forgiveness you need to have around it, because that's what they do. Singers sing. A kid who's visually inclined is going to write on everything. A kid who's a writer is going to have a journal, secret journals upon journals, from the time that they're very young. And let them know that to be a visual artist is okay, that there are other people who, years ago I used to work at the Met, I used to see kids all the time, their parents would bring them and just drop them off and for the tours, kids tours. Mm-hmm. And the kids would know everything in the museum, but the parent will let the kid know that this is okay. Mm-hmm. Like all this stuff, the abstraction, it's okay, even if the parent didn't understand it often. Just letting the kid know that it's okay, gave that kid validation.
And I'll just say, it's like kids know parks, they know grocery stores, and they know like Fruit Loops, right? So Fruit Loops are red. They put them in the middle shelf, right? So kids know color at a very early age. When I say bring them to a place where looking is paramount, what they'll begin to do is look at their marks, right? So what we think about children and the art that they make, children will make them, and we spend more time looking at those brilliant lines than they do, right? So how do you get them to start looking as a real rigorous activity?
Thank you all very much for a wonderful panel and for sharing so much. I had a question for Torkwase. I'm a student and scholar in Black Studies, and very much so think a lot about narratives of Black suffering and representations of Birmingham and Selma in particular, and how Black artists like Bethany Collins and Theaster Gates abstract that violence toward really helpful, productive ends for those who are able to see their work. I was curious if you could speak more about Christina Sharp's concept and wake work and what you see her work doing to speak to the kind of intersection of abstraction and Blackness.
Sure. So Christina Sharp has written this book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. And again, because I went to Tougaloo, a lot of my work is based on research. So I start with my own ideas and who I am, and then I look to social scientists to bring these ideas out of me that I could never have done, right? To create these intersections and multiples that I could not have done. So thinking about that work in the way, so Christina proposes that we are still existing in the post-slavery moment, and thinking about the ripples of a post-slavery moment, we're always doing and responding and being in that reverberation, if that's the right word. But then she talks about wake work, and that is work, right? Sort of that functions as a resistance to the sort of horrors of slavery on many levels. So Christina's book takes us through survivors of natural disasters or instances of individuals who are trying to figure out the impact of slavery even now. So this is this text that I'm really, really super invested in. And that kind of wake work is what I'm thinking about when I think about like Black compositional thought or hypershape. So if Christina proposes, and Christina, Saidiya Hartman, the most brilliant people talking out loud on the planet today, these women are, if they are challenging us to not look for a solution, but really giving us frameworks to unpack what it means to survive slavery, but also, and Saidiya Hartman talks about this, not only be a witness, but a regarder of these things, right? So how do I then regard someone like William Box Brown? Or how do I regard someone like Harriet Jacobs? Or how do I even think about the work in this exhibition? So my practice of regarding it is, say, again, how do I get closer to that history, to those images through the genre of abstraction I'm interested in? So the practice, or my, if I ever live up to this, my wake work is to not only think about the ways people have dissected Henry Box Brown's self-emancipation through shipping in a box, but understand that after he shipped himself to freedom, he replayed that shipment as a way, a performative way, to make a certain kind of income, but also retell a story. So he was retelling that trauma over and over again through this passage, right? But the thing about the recreation of his self-liberation is he understood paintings of the day, right? So he understood a kind of painting that went with what it meant to re-represent the South. So he created this sort of presentation where he thought about landscape painting, made this sort of banner of a landscape painting of the day, restaged the self-emancipation, and he was a magic man. So my job, knowing that now more people of color are moving and adjusting around the planet because of environmental disasters, right? So we have more environmental disasters, more environmental refugees than any other kind of refugee, right? And that has to do with like war and climate. So if I am going to understand geniuses like Box Brown, then I have to understand what it means to self-emancipate, what it means to move the body through space, and how Black geniuses like Box Brown, like Harriet Jacobs, like Harriet Tubman, had a knowledge, a scientific knowledge of space and shape to get them through, right? So my wake work is not looking at their bodies, but trying to figure out a real sort of genius behind what does it mean to be self-navigation, or what does it mean to understand space and shape and weight and density and movement and speed under different climates. So the language is, my language is trying to get closer to those shapes and spaces. So I think about density, I think about proximity, I think about color in relationship to darkness and night and, you know, different kinds of water and water instances. I'm a scuba diver, so I spend a lot of time in the Gulf of Mexico, 100 feet deep, trying to figure out what it means to be a part of particle history, like shit like that, right? So for me, that's what I'm doing in my studio privately while I'm reading and listening to Saidiya. I mean, just that whole thing, because they guide me and keep me vast in that thinking. So that's why I'm just trying to be a part of the cool kids, you know, at that point. I'm just trying to do that, you know, work.
No, it's interesting, like with Box Brown, the proximity of that genius, or the borders around that genius were re-enslavement or death.
Right.
So we're talking about people who reinvented themselves, had to learn to navigate within these spaces and then express themselves, right? Free themselves, at least mentally, because around their activity, if they made a mistake, re-enslavement or death. Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. And negotiating the fugitive slave laws, like Anthony Burns. Like, what does it mean to hide in the hull of a ship? Like the hold, you know how they talk about the hold, right? This idea of the curve, the hold, the black body in the hold. So we know how artists have dealt with the curve, right? And that we can go to Ellsworth Kelly. Now he has that curve on lockdown, right? So what if I extract that Ellsworth Kelly curve and say maybe the curve is a shape language? If I get rid of color as a simple, not a simple, I won't say that. If I get rid of color as a way to enter that shape language and really think about architecture and really think about physics, then the curve is a hypershape, right? Because we are in the wake of the curve. We are in the wake of the slave ships. So I just do it by myself in my studio.
Yeah, I think, I think we time for just anything you want to say, Philandis and Sheila, or that's just we.
No, I just really want to thank everybody for coming out.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.
And end it here. Thank you.